And good afternoon. This is episode 66 of Thursdays with Charlie. We're ready for the 26th of August in 2021. I want to say a few words about the situation in Afghanistan. Things are not going well in this operation that's obviously been poorly planned of evacuating the U.S. troops and citizens and our allies from Afghanistan. One congressional leader commented this week that the people in charge couldn't organize a two-car funeral effectively. At any rate, I'd like to repeat what I said at the masses last weekend. Anyone who knows that I served in the United States military forces already knows what I think of the cause and the handling of the tragic situation currently in Afghanistan. We need to pray long and hard and frequently that somehow out of all this we'll be able to evacuate the thousands of Americans still stranded behind enemy lines in Afghanistan. That's looking less and less likely as the days of this week go on. So far, the deadly combination of arrogance and ignorance at the highest levels of our government have been almost overwhelming, as they are, I think, to any veterans in our country especially. As one CNN reporter commented, "If this isn't failure, what does failure look like?" Leaders in our government have claimed that no one saw this coming. As I said over the weekend, Stevie Wonder could have seen this coming. Please pray for our fellow Americans and the Afghans who supported us as that they may escape from this tragic situation. And pray for the Afghans, especially the women and the young girls who are going to have to face a life under the Taliban after we leave. And please always remember that making choices in life is important. When making choices, that means those choices have real consequences in real life. Consequences for ourselves, for our families, for our communities, and for our nation. Sometimes even for the whole world. This is playing out right now in real time in front of our eyes. It should be an indelible lesson for all of us. But keep those prayers coming. I decided I wanted to do something a little lighthearted for the show this week, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. People say that I talk a lot about food, and in my books I write a lot about food, and in my sermons I mention food and drink very, very frequently. It does seem to be a recurring topic. You recall that I mentioned buying my 30-pound watermelon and wrestling it to cut it up in pieces on my counter. I mentioned that I had purchased apricots when they were on sale for only 10 cents a pound some years ago, and I bought 25 pounds of them because they were on sale, and the things that ensued from that. At any rate, I spent some time this week, and I went back over my life to see what I could remember of food stories in my life. Some of these you may have heard already from me. Some of them may be new to you, but I thought it'd be fun. It certainly was fun for me to think back over them, and I hope you all have some fun as I share them with you. My earliest food story goes back to 1948. When I was 6 months old. I was born in January of 48. My parents in the summer of 48, late July, decided that they would like to take a drive from New Jersey up into eastern Canada, Montreal, Nova Scotia, up in that area of Canada, and then drive back. Now, I don't remember a lot about the trip. I was 6 months old. But I do remember my mother telling me that the only food they could find on the trip, for me, apparently baby foods weren't available readily in 1948 in the Northeast United States or in Canada. They fed me for a week to 10 days on nothing but green peas, which my mother mashed up, and mashed potatoes. That was about it for the whole week to 10 days. The funny thing is, when I became a child and I could remember eating and things like that, I hated green peas. I hated green peas until I was an adult, and then I got to like green peas. But I loved mashed potatoes right from the very beginning. So 6 months old, my first food story, green peas and mashed potatoes on a trip to Canada. When I was a young child and growing up in Queen of Peace Parish in North Arlington, New Jersey, my parents would take me to Mass every weekend. Now, there were no Saturday evening Masses at that time, so we would always go on Sunday morning, probably mid-morning around 10 or 11 o'clock, and there I think were the Mass schedules then. One of my fondest memories is that the priest who baptized me, Father William Piga, was still assigned to Queen of Peace Parish when I was a child. He was there for several years. And one of the things he would do is he would actually, and it was a little bit unusual back in the late 40s, early 50s for a priest to be doing this, he would greet people coming into Mass. He would be outside in his cassock and greeting us. And he would always have a box of Luden's wild cherry cough drops with him. And I remember, I'm sure he did it for other children too, but always for me, I would put my hand out and Father Piga would put in a Luden's wild cherry cough drop and I would pop it into my mouth. And my mother would criticize him for it, saying, "Why are you giving him something to eat?" And his response was, "Well, he's not going to receive communion yet. He's too young, and he'll enjoy this." I think I was way into my late childhood before I realized that Luden's wild cherry cough drops were not just pieces of really good candy. I got to like them, and I got to look forward to it. And I have to admit, it probably was forced to make me want to go to church on Sunday morning because I knew that that was coming. Now, I know I've told you the story of my first Holy Communion. I was 7 years old, dressed in my white suit, looking like something like Johnny Travolta from Saturday Night Fever in my white suit. And, I was so excited and so happy. And we went out to the Lyndhurst Diner for breakfast after First Communion. And I picked up a huge glass of orange juice and spilled it right down myself, really destroying much of the white suit. I never understood why orange juice would be such a problem to white material, but apparently it was. My other childhood memory of food is New Year's Eve. Every New Year's Eve when we lived in North Arlington, my parents would have a party. And the party was for all the adults and families in the neighborhood. And they would be upstairs in our house. And they would have whatever they wanted for their meals and their snacks and hors d'oeuvres. Meanwhile, all of the kids, we were down in the basement of my house, and we would have chips and other things. But sometimes you'd go upstairs and you'd notice what the adults were eating. And one of the things that I noticed was they had anchovies, those little salted fish, on top of Ritz crackers, just sort of curled around on the top of Ritz crackers. And my mother and father would let me have one on New Year's Eve, a Ritz cracker with an anchovy on it. And I loved it. It was really wonderful. So one year, I was probably about 8 or 9. My birthday is in January, right after New Year's, really. And so for my birthday, my parents got me a box of Ritz crackers and a can of anchovies. And so we opened up the anchovies, we lined up the Ritz crackers, we piled on the anchovies and lined them up there, and then I started eating them. And I had way too many anchovies on Ritz crackers. In fact, I got sick from it, and right after that, until adulthood, I could not even smell an anchovy without feeling sick. It was kind of like the green peas and mashed potatoes at 6 months old. hated green peas until adulthood, but loved mashed potatoes. Well, I hated anchovies until I discovered them in Caesar salads later on as an adult, but loved Ritz crackers as a child growing up. When I was a child, my mother would always have me drink 2 glasses of milk every day, 1 in the morning and 1 in the evening before I went to bed. 2 like 8-ounce glasses of white milk. Now, I did not like milk, but because I was supposed to do it, I did it. The night before my 13th birthday, this was January the 18th, 1961, the night before my 13th birthday, my mother said to me, "What would you like for your birthday? We will get you anything you want that we can afford." And I thought about it, and I looked at my mother and said, "Do you really mean anything as long as you can afford it?" And my mother said, "Yes, you're going to become a teenager. That's a big thing. It's a big step. We want to do something to make this memorable." And I said, "Okay, this is what I want. No more milk, ever." And so the night of January 18th, 1961, the night before my 13th birthday, I drank my last glass of milk. I have never had one since then. Now, I have had buttermilk occasionally to try, but no homogenized, regular white milk. That doesn't mean I don't enjoy milk in other forms. I love it in the form of ice cream, and I love cheese and things made with milk, but no more glasses of milk since January 18th, 1961. I have one food story that I always associate with my father. When I was a kid growing up in North Arlington, again, I had mentioned there were no Saturday evening masses, but our big treat on Saturday night is we could drive, my father could drive, up the Belleville Pike, it was the big road in town, to Journal Square in Jersey City. And you were able around 10 o'clock at night to buy the Sunday papers, because they would already be printed and being delivered. But if you drove to Journal Square, you could buy the Sunday papers. So my father would go, and sometimes I'd go with him, and we would buy the Sunday papers, and then on the way back, we would stop and we would either grab a bag of bagels or a pizza and come home. And on Saturday night, late at night, we would sit in the living room, and my dad and I would sit on the floor, and he would read the comics to me while we ate pizza or bagels or sometimes both. That's one of the great memories I have of childhood with my dad. And of course, because of the communion fast when I was above the age of 7, we had to make sure we were finished by midnight. So whatever we were eating, we finished because we had a fast for communion the next morning from 12 midnight. I don't know if everybody remembers back in those days, there were no evening masses. Masses were always in the morning. The last mass was sometimes, if you were lucky, your parish had a noon mass, and you still had a fast from any food or drink except water from midnight the night before. Well, in 1961, my parents and I moved from North Arlington, New Jersey, and we moved up to Montvale, New Jersey, about 40 miles north of there, right on the border of New York State. One of my first memories in Montvale is I was alone in the house, and I had seen my mother cooking, and I decided that I was going to make something. I'm not a good cook, never have been, and probably never will be. But one of the things that fascinated me in the kitchen was an implement my mother used called a pressure cooker. And I can't remember what I was going to cook, but I do remember being alone in the house and getting the pressure cooker out and getting it up on the stove and doing something with it. The next thing I know, I was out of the room and the pressure cooker exploded. There was a large sound, a lot of mess in the kitchen, which I tried to clean up before my mother got home. That kind of convinced me at a young age that maybe cooking was not going to be my strong suit. And our neighbor right across the street from where we lived in Montvale on Upper Saddle River Road, it even sounds nice to say that, Upper Saddle River Road, were an older couple. They were in their late 70s, early 80s, Gussie and Al Jansen. And Al had been a former councilman in Montvale in its early days. And Gussie was a housewife like my mother, but a really sweet old lady whom I always enjoyed, and she was always really nice to me. Well, this one day, again, I was alone in the house. My mother and father, Dad was at work, and Mom had gone out shopping or something, and I smelled gas in the kitchen. I could almost smell, be sure, yeah, I think I smelled gas. So I wanted to be sure that I smelled gas. So I called on the phone. There were no cell phones at the time. The phone was also in the kitchen. So I got on the phone and I dialed Mrs. Jansen, Gussie Jansen, and I said, I'm going to try something. She said, what? And she said, where's your mother? I said, she's out shopping. And I said, I think I smell gas. I want to find out for sure. So I'm going to light a match and I'm going to leave the phone off the hook. If you hear anything like an explosion, would you please come over? And I remember saying that to this older woman. And as soon as I put the phone down, she was so panic-stricken, she started running from her house down the driveway across the street to get to the house, and she got to the garage of our house about the same time my mother was pulling in from shopping, and Gussie's trying to tell my mother over and over, what's happening, that your son's going to blow himself up in the house. Again, probably I should stay out of kitchens. It's not a safe place for me. And then I remember one Halloween, Mom and Gussie were really good friends, and they decided on Halloween that they were going to get dressed up as hobos, and they were going to go around the neighborhood and see if they could get candy from all the neighbors. So this one Halloween, I was probably 10 or 12 years old at the time, maybe a little older than that. I had to stay home to give candy to the neighborhood kids who came by because my mother and my neighbor were out trying to go trick-or-treating. And here they were, they covered their faces with all sorts of soot and wore hats and like kind of an overcoat type thing. And they went over, and one of the neighbors, the neighbor on the other side of our house across the street, threw them out. She said, you people get out of here, you shouldn't be in our neighborhood. And they didn't come back with too much candy at all. I should mention, I talk about that old neighborhood. 3 houses down from me, when I grew up, there was a guy whom I didn't know, but again, I don't follow sports that much, but Joe Namath was one of my neighbors when I grew up. Not that I knew it at the time or appreciated the fact that I had someone who was kind of current in the field of sports right by. Well, coming into my teenage years, I had friends, and I would have them over sometimes to the house. We'd gather at one another's homes, and I decided one time, again, not learning that I should stay out of the kitchen, I decided I was going to make dinner for some of my friends. And one of the things we had in the house that I knew about, we had a huge ham that my mother had made. And I know we were trying to eat up the ham during the week and to get rid of it and not waste it. And I knew we had potatoes, and I said, oh, I will make hash, ham and potatoes, make it into a casserole, and I would serve it to my friends. So I invited a few friends over for dinner and said, I'm going to make dinner. And they all laughed, but we're going to try. I go into the kitchen. My mother was out. My father was at work. And I couldn't remember how you made hash. And so I thought, well, you probably have to do it in a blender. And so I took the potatoes, which I had boiled, and I put them into a blender. and it was spinning around nicely. And then I took a couple of slices of ham, and I figured, well, I throw that in the blender, and that makes hash. And well, I threw the ham in the blender, and it whipped it around really nicely, but I ended up with this really runny pink mashed potatoes. And it was getting late, and it was too late to do something else, so I literally poured the mixture from the blender into a baking pan, and I baked it and cut it into squares and served it to them. They were all looking at this pink concoction, and I said, "It's hash. We won't do it again. I hope you like it." Pretty much obvious why my friends, when I grew up even to adulthood, whenever I would have dinner at their house, I would say, "What are we having?" And my friends, if they had dinner by me, they would say, "Where are we going for dinner?" My luck in the kitchen did not get any better. One of my best friends when I was growing up in New Jersey in high school was a guy by the name of Mike Bullock. And Mike and I met on the first day of school, the first day of high school, freshman year in New Jersey. And it was a regional high school. We came from different towns, miles apart, but we decided first day that we really enjoyed being with one another, and so we would have lunch together every day. And we sat at the same lunch table in the cafeteria. And one of the differences that we soon noticed is Mike's mother made everything from scratch. She baked, she prepared things from scratch. There was always something wonderful and homemade. My mother did a lot of shopping. My mother worked outside the home, and so she bought a lot of things from the store. So if Hostess came out with a new cupcake, I had the new cupcake. Mike, however, had homemade things. His mother was famous for making wonderful lemon cake and all sorts of other treats. Well, I would look over at him and, wow, that looks impressive. And he would look over at me because he didn't get a lot of store-bought stuff, and he's watching. And we, after a couple of days, swapped and said, "Here, why don't you try this?" And he liked my store-bought cupcakes and baked goods and things like that. And I loved his mother's homemade things. Well, we began a thing that lasted for 4 years of high school. Whenever we had lunch together, we would just get to the point where we would swap lunch bags. We would sit at the table, I'd give him my lunch, I'd take his lunch, and we would eat it. It never dawned on either one of us to say anything to our mothers about this. In 1985, many years later, I was officiating at Mike's wedding. I was marrying him to Joan. It was a beautiful church in Somerset, New Jersey, and we went to the reception. And of course, our mothers were there, and they were talking, and Mike and I were talking, and we just in front of our mothers happened to say, "Hey, remember back in high school how we used to swap lunches?" And both of our mothers stopped and just said, "What?" And we said, "Oh yeah, we used to do this in high school. I used to love the homemade things you made." And Mike said, "Oh, I used to love all the stuff you bought." And we would just swap our bagged lunches. And both mothers, "You didn't eat the lunch that I prepared for you?" "No, Charlie ate Mike's and Mike ate Charlie's." They found out at Mike's wedding that we had done that some 20 or so years before. There's another food story with Mike and I that I think is kind of funny. I don't remember the other kid's name, but there was some kid when we were in high school who just kind of bothered us. He grated against us, but his family was kind of well-to-do, and they had a swimming pool. And Mike and I decided that it would be a wonderful idea someday if we would get boxes of Jell-O and fill his swimming pool with Jell-O so that when he dived into it, he would bounce on the surface of it. We were plotting this one day over at Mike's house, and we were talking about how we were going to go about doing it. And Mike's mother was overhearing what we were saying, And she didn't comment on it, and she didn't say don't do it or anything, but she did, as she passed by once, she said, "You do realize if you're going to fill the pool with Jello, you have to boil at least half of it." And that spoiled our plans for filling his pool with Jello. I mentioned before, my mom worked outside the house, so Mom kind of got used to always bringing home food. And even as we got older, that was the custom, that instead of cooking something at home, Mom would stop by a restaurant or stop by a deli or stop by the food store and bring something home. It was always kind of a treat. I didn't realize quite how far that had gone until many, many years later. I was already ordained as a priest, and I was coming home on Sundays after my parish duties, and I would go home, and my mom would ask me if I wanted anything. And this one Sunday I came home. It was the middle of Sunday afternoon, and I drove time. As normal, we would take my mom out for dinner on Sunday. My father had died by then, so Mom was alone. And I came home, and I got home, and I was changing into some more comfortable clothes for Sunday afternoon. And Mom said, "Would you like something?" And I said, I would really like a cup of coffee. Now, I drink black coffee. I don't put anything in it, no sugar, no milk, no cream, no flavoring, just black coffee. And I told my mother that, and I walked into my old bedroom at home to change. And I go in to change, and I could swear I hear the garage door, and I go out in the kitchen. My mom's nowhere to be seen. And I finish changing, I come out and I'm waiting, and then I hear the garage door open again, and my mother comes in, and she's got a cup of black coffee that she went down to the local deli and purchased for me. And she hands it to me, and I said, Mom, we can make this at home. We could actually brew coffee here. Well, this is the way I always get it. Okay, I learned that coffee making was not going to be done very much in my house. I think of that every morning when I make coffee for myself at home. I have a Keurig now, and I make the coffee, but I remember that day when Mom brought the coffee home for me from the deli. Now, I want to go back a little bit to when I was in the seminary, back in the 60s and the early 70s. There were a lot of rules that we had to follow, and one of the rules was we were not allowed to have visitors except on the afternoon of the first Sunday of the month. And so every other weekday or weeknight or weekend, we could not have visitors, and we were not allowed to leave the seminary property. Now, right next to my seminary in Mahwah, New Jersey, was a cemetery, Mary Rest Cemetery, and it happened to be where my father was buried. And I inquired, and I found out that the cemetery and the seminary were considered the same piece of property by the church. So technically, if I walked down to the cemetery to my father's grave, I was not leaving the property. And my mother would come up on Sunday, and she would go very frequently to visit my father's grave. Well, it just so happened that we would kind of line up the times. I'll be down at the cemetery around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And Mom would plan to be up at the cemetery about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But before she would come, she would stop at the local bakery. And she would have maybe a shopping bag or two filled with wonderful baked goods from the bakery. It was Walter's Bakery, Walter's Quality Bakery in Montvale, New Jersey. Well, I would walk down in my cassock, sometimes with a coat on, down to the cemetery, but I would walk back up from the cemetery with 1 or 2 shopping bags of baked goods. Well, my classmates quickly found out that Sunday was a good day to come over and visit my room because we had no place to store the stuff. And so by Sunday night, it would all be distributed among my friends in the seminary. At that time, there was 311 of us guys in the seminary, so the food got to sometimes get stretched out. But it was kind of nice. My mom and I would meet in the cemetery almost every Sunday during my seminary years. And Sundays in the seminary were a real treat because it was the only day of the week that we got ice cream. On Sunday, there would be a container of ice cream put on every table for dinner. And there were 8 of us at a table, and you had to sit in seniority. So the people who were about to be ordained or closer to ordination sat at one end of the table, and you worked your way down to those who were the youngest. The ice cream would always be placed at the head of the table where the older students were. And everybody would dig in and put into your plate. Now, if you were lucky and you were at a table where people were kind and considerate, there was always ice cream for everybody. If you were unlucky and were at a table where the senior students felt they had earned it, they would take the ice cream, and by the time the lower, younger students got it, you would end up with either no ice cream or just a little bit of ice cream. It's funny, I love ice cream to today, and vanilla ice cream is still my favorite. Another seminary story about food was pizza. One of the things we liked was to watch TV, but there were only 4 TVs in the whole building, one on each floor's rec room. Remember, I said there were 311 guys, and so there were 4 stories in the seminary, and there were 4 television sets. The 3rd floor rec room would watch on Tuesday nights, I believe, I may be wrong on the date, Star Trek. We would gather at 10 o'clock in the evening to watch Star Trek. Well, now a bunch of guys, and there might be 15 or 20 of us gathered in there, and that was what the TV on the 3rd floor had on Star Trek. The 4th floor had a different show on, the 2nd floor had a different show on, but we would watch Star Trek. Well, we wanted something to go with watching the thing, and you didn't have refrigerators or anything like that in your room, and so we got the idea, well, we could go downstairs to the payphones. There were 2 payphones in the building, and you could go to the payphone, and we could call the local pizza place in Mahwah, New Jersey, and ask them to deliver. And so we would order 5 or 6 pizzas. Somebody would go out to the side door on the 1st floor. We would collect money and give it to him. He would then pay the pizza thing and come back up to the 3rd floor rec room with 5 or 6 pizzas. And we would eat the pizzas. Now, the problem was we now had 5 or 6 large pizza boxes that we had to get rid of. And if we put them in the garbage at the 3rd floor rec room, well, everybody would know that it was us who was doing it. So on your way back to your room after Star Trek, each week, one of the guys would take one box, some of the guys would take another box, and we would distribute them around the building so that nobody could know where the pizza boxes were coming from. We got away with that for several years. My other seminary food story is one of my friends in the seminary was a year younger than me. He was Patterson Diocese, John English. And John, when he would go home or when his family would come up to visit, his grandmother made the most amazing spice cake. And it was a tomato soup cake. No icing, just a wonderful cake. And she used tomato soup in it. It always struck me as odd. John could never get the recipe, but I got to know his grandmother, and kind of in an example of uselessness, his grandmother gave me the recipe for a tomato soup cake that I probably in the past 40 years have only made once or twice. But I still remember how good it tastes, and somewhere in my boxes at home, I still have that handwritten recipe for how to make tomato soup cake. Well, now we get into the time when I'm a priest over here, and one of my parishioners served me over at her house, her and her husband, scallops wrapped in bacon. And they were so delicious. And I was enjoying eating them so very much. And I commented, I said, these are wonderful, scallops wrapped in bacon. I said, there must have been a lot of work doing this. And she said, oh no, you just buy them in the food store. They're in the freezer. And I said, really? So I go to ShopRite, was the store near us. I go into ShopRite, and there was a package of these, and there were about 6, I believe, in the package. They were big scallops, but they were about $1 a piece per scallop. So it was like $5 or $6 for this little frozen box of scallops. So I came back, and after a few weeks, she said to me, she said, well, have you bought some of the scallops and tried them? I said, no. I said, they're grossly expensive. Now I feel bad for all the scallops I ate when I was at your house. And she said, oh, no, they're worth it. So the next week, she comes to church, and she brings me 2 boxes of scallops. And I have these wonderful frozen boxes of scallops. It never dawned on me to read the instructions on how you would prepare them. I just saw bacon wrapped scallops. Well, in the rectory where I was at the time, we had a toaster oven. And so I opened one box of the scallops, and I put the scallops in on the tray in the toaster oven, and I closed it and turned it on. I know I got busy in the kitchen doing something. Maybe I was trying to get some soda or iced tea out of the refrigerator or whatever. The next thing I know, the toaster oven is on fire. And it's flaming. And I'm scared. And it's flaming, flames in the kitchen. It's right underneath the kitchen cabinet, so I'm afraid the cabinets are going to go up in smoke. I'm trying to throw water on it. Finally, I was able to grab the plug and unplug it so I didn't have to deal with the electricity problem. Burned up the toaster oven, completely destroyed it. It did really char the scallops quite well, and I did eat them, but now I had a box of frozen scallops left that I didn't have a toaster oven to cook in. So I am not sure what I did with those. Again, the moral of the story is I don't do well in kitchens. Then I got an idea, well, should be able to cook something, and I found a recipe for popcorn cake. You take popcorn and you kind of form it into a cake, one of those cakes with the hole in the middle, like a bundt cake, only you make it out of popcorn. It looks so good on the recipe and the picture and the way they serve slices of it. However, every time I made it, and I tried it a couple of times, it ended up like a brick that nobody could cut, and I could never serve. I could do damage with it, but nobody could serve it. At any rate, these are all a little bit of interesting stories, and I can remember one Christmas getting a lot of food gifts for Christmas, like little decorated baskets or gift wrap things. And I love fruitcake for Christmas, you know that already. Well, this one Christmas I got several large baskets. People were very generous to me. They're very good to me as the priest, and I appreciate that very much. And I had them at home, and my brother Michael was with me. And I looked and I said, look at all this food. What are we going to do? And without blinking, he looked at me and he said, we're going to be like rich folks today. I said, what do you mean? He said, sit down. And so we both sat on the floor. I know we were in our 40s easily. We both sat on the floor, and he said, we're going to open every one of those packages, and we're going to taste every one of those foods. And then we'll either give it away or we'll put it away or freeze it or whatever. But we're going to taste everything. And so that Christmas day, Michael and I sat on the living room floor, opened up dozens of packages of homemade and store-bought foods, and just tasted a little piece. Apparently that's what rich folks do. The last stories I want to tell you have to do with my first pastor as a deacon. I was in a parish for a year as a deacon before I was ordained as a priest. And this pastor was Dave Kazaza. And Dave was a former Navy chaplain. He had 30 years in the United States Navy. And he retired as a very senior Navy captain. Did a really beautiful job. Well, he came, and he had a lot of Navy buddies who would come and visit us. And that was always fun, and they would go out and eat and have a good time. And this one time, Dave says to me, and this was rare, I was a deacon, I was not a priest, I had not been in the military yet, and he had some of his Navy friends coming over, and he says, why don't you come to dinner with us, Charlie? And that was an honor to be invited out by your pastor in those days. And so I said, oh, yeah, I'd love that. So we went out. We went to Monero's Steakhouse in New Jersey. It was near where the parish was. The parish was in River Edge that I was in. And we go out to Monero's Steakhouse. And these Navy guys and my pastor, they had a wonderful time, and they were eating and drinking and having a great time. In fact, so much so, and they had ordered so much that at the end of the meal, the manager comes over and he says to my pastor, who was kind of organizing all this, he said, you know, you've been so good. We've enjoyed having all of you here. I'd like to treat you to an after-dinner drink. And, oh, hey, yeah, sure. And everybody was ordering something. And I don't drink that much. And certainly an after-dinner drink was not a real treat. And so I leaned over. I was sitting next to my pastor, and I said, Dave, can I order ice cream instead? And he just glared at me. He said, don't you dare embarrass me. Have something to drink. And so I did. I think I ordered a creme de menthe or something like that. The other thing that I remember with Dave and food is if ever we got Chinese food, I would always order egg rolls. And I would always order extra egg rolls. And I would put the leftover ones in the refrigerator. And the next morning, I would have cold egg rolls with hot Chinese mustard for breakfast. And Dave would just look at me and say, how? How can you do that to your stomach? I think of that whenever I have an egg roll now. Well, that's enough stories about food. You're probably tired of listening to them. I'm not tired of talking about them, and I haven't covered all of them, but I think I've covered enough to let you know that food and I go very well together, but kitchens and I do not mix too well. It's time for Pascal to come on down. And as always, he brings us a message. And as always, it's in Latin, and it's an appropriate one. Tu est enim propter cibum. Tu est enim propter cibum. You are what you eat. Good lesson. You are what you eat. Think about that the next time you're having cold egg rolls and hot mustard. Have a great day.